and I would like to present to you now two important research projects that have been developed at UNESCO IESALC as part of its research portfolio. The first one regards women's participation in higher education in Africa. This is a research that has been taking place since 2021, and it's a research that wants to understand a little bit the context of the participation of female participation in the higher education sector in some of the African countries. The research started first understanding the Eastern African context, which was the first assessment phase, where three countries were analyzed. These countries are Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda. During this research phase, the idea was to analyze the participation of women in various levels of education, including graduation and post-graduation, PhD levels, etc. Also to include the participation of women and assess this participation in leadership positions inside the higher education institutions, as well as the context where these females find once they are inside the higher education system. As part of this first assessment phase, we have a flagship report, which is the one that you can see on the screen, which is available on our web page. The second phase of this African research of the participation of women in the African higher education sector regards the Southern African context. In the second phase, which we are calling the second assessment phase, 9 countries were part of the sample. These countries you can see also on the screen. These are Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Lesotho, Eswatini, and Mozambique. So we analyzed higher education institutions inside those countries. In this part of the research, we also have a research report, which is going to be available very soon on our webpage. In this research, we have also analyzed, similar to what we did in the first phase, we have also analyzed the full participation, the full elements that regards the participation of women in higher education, including the graduation, enrollment, also in post-graduation courses, the work conditions for females inside the institutions, also the research component, how many women, for example, we have as researchers in comparison, for example, to their male colleagues, and also their participation in the leadership positions. So we have expanded a little bit in the second assessment phase the number of countries, and this is a work in progress research. This research will count with other phases which are being now designed in collaboration with colleagues in the African offices, and this is going to take place from January 2014 on. The second research I would like to briefly introduce to you is the one which we are doing about gender-based violence in higher education institutions. This is a research that has been developed together with the gender, higher education, and health education sectors at Paris. And here the idea is to understand what are the antecedents of gender-based violence in higher education institutions. What are the factors associated with it? We also want to analyze the consequences of this phenomenon, for example, if there are any outcomes, any consequences in terms of health, educational, psychosocial, social, and also economic consequences for those who are part or who suffer from this kind of violence. We also want to understand what are the groups that are most affected inside the institutions with this phenomenon. And in the end, we also want to assess what is the institutional support in terms of the barriers, for example, or the facilitating measures that are in place to support access to services and justice for those subjected to violence in the institutions. Also the tools, for example, or the instruments that can be used to reduce the phenomenon inside the institutions, and what are the measures that exist inside the institutions, the higher education institutions, to prevent this phenomenon. What are the prevention mechanisms, the prevention measures that can be developed? So these are the elements that we want to analyze in this research. We have already done a pilot survey that was done earlier this year, and we presented the data from this pilot survey during the International Women's Day. And here, very briefly, I can show the audience which is now with us some of the results that we have received, or some of the results that we have gathered during this pilot phase. So, for example, we have analyzed the first component of the gender-based violence, which is the psychological, the emotional violence. And we found, for example, that a significant women that were part of the sample that we had strongly agreed that they have experienced any action or statement related to psychological and emotional violence inside the higher education institutions, for example. So they have analyzed, they have mentioned that they have experienced emotional violence at the institutions, or they have perceived hostility toward women inside the institutions. And they also have said that in a small sample, but they also have analyzed that they fear retaliation, that they have been offended, but at the same time, they also trust the institution that it will protect them or report, or that they can report in case they suffer this kind of violence. So very briefly here, of course, we have a lot of more data on that, which is also available on our webpage, but this is just for our audience now to have an idea of some of the preliminary data that we had on the aspect of emotional violence. We have also analyzed the aspect of physical violence, and also we have here in smaller numbers, but this has also been reported. So, for example, that they fear if they feel safe or not, for example, around other classmates or colleagues, or if, for example, physical violence is preceded by psychological violence, or if the campus becomes unsafe, for example, at irregular schedules. So these are some of the elements that we have analyzed that you can also see there some of the results. The third component that we have analyzed in this pilot phase was in terms of sexual harassment. And then here we have seen that conduct of verbal nature were the most reported experience by the respondents, right? So they have said yes, insulting language or sex-related comments or unnecessary physical contact, for example. This was some of the elements that were included in the answers that were reported by the respondents during this pilot phase. And the last component that we have analyzed was in terms of the institutional support that we have here called institutional violence. So when asked about what contributed to the risk of gender-based violence in the institutions, most respondents reported the low levels, for example, of prevention, or the absence of an effective response system inside their institutions, as well as gender inequality. So here we analyze several aspects. For example, if the university investigates or not the incidents that happens, the lack of women representation in decision making, the absence, for example, of a university policy responding to this phenomenon, which was also reported by some of the respondents, the lack of human or material resources, for example, to respond to the issue, lack of acknowledgement or lack of gender sensibilization events or programs. So there were a portfolio of elements that we have analyzed here. Again, I say that this data is available in the UNESCO IASALG's webpage. So very briefly, these were the two research projects which focus on gender and higher education that I would like to present to you now. Thank you very much. My name is Danielle Vieira and I'm coordinating those research projects here at UNESCO IASALG. Thank you for your attention.